That year, across the Pacific, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara spoke of an invisible wall that would seal the war shut. He called it an electronic barrier, a vast system of sensors, aircraft, and computers designed to detect every movement along the mountains of Trung Son. He declared that not even a mouse could slip through. It was the language of technology, of budgets measured in billions, of confidence that war could be managed through signals and screens. But deep in the Trung Son jungle, where monsoon rain fell in sheets and red mud clung stubbornly to tires, convoys still moved through the night. There were no declarations here, no figures in dollars, only young drivers gripping their steering wheels, eyes strained against the thick darkness of the forest. In their trucks were sacks of rice, crates of ammunition, medicine, and letters from families in the north carefully wrapped in plastic to keep them dry. They did not know the calculations made in distant offices. They only knew that if this shipment failed to arrive, somewhere in the south a unit would run short of food, short of bullets, perhaps short of the will to endure. They said not even a mouse could pass through, yet night after night the trucks kept moving. The sound of engines was swallowed by the jungle. Tires crushed gravel and disappeared into the rain. Between the confident declaration and the quiet reality on the ground, war was no longer about technology. It was about endurance, about men who had no choice but to keep driving, even knowing that the sky above them might open with fire. The barrier was not made of barbed wire or concrete. It was built from circuitry and numbers. 47 American scientists helped design it. $2 billion were poured into the project at a time when the war was already expanding. From across the ocean, it was believed that with enough sensors and enough computing power, every movement along the mountains of Trung Son could be detected. The most common device was disguised as a tropical plant. Dropped into the jungle, it buried itself in the soil, 4 thin antennae spread outward to listen for the slightest vibration. Footsteps, tires grinding over gravel, low voices carried through the night. Everything became an electrical signal. Within a minute, in a command center hundreds of kilometers away, screens would light up. Coordinates appeared. Aircraft were dispatched. When the bombs fell, the forest ceased to be a forest. Earth was torn open. Trees were uprooted. A road cleared yesterday could vanish in a single barrage. With this system, war was reduced to response times and probability. It was believed that no convoy could pass unnoticed. For the drivers and engineers moving along the trail, that meant every movement risked being heard. No human eye needed to see them. A tremor in the ground was enough for the sky to answer with engines and fire. Walking exposed them. Driving exposed them. Carrying supplies made concealment even harder. The sense of being watched did not come from soldiers hiding nearby, but from the soil beneath their own feet. On one side stood absolute confidence in technology. On the other stood men who had to move through a landscape where even silence could betray them. In a short time, the supply routes grew heavier with tension. Each convoy waited longer before moving. Every scouting step weighed more carefully on the soil. It was not that the jungle had grown thicker, but that the ground itself seemed to have ears. There were nights when trucks had to stop in the middle of the forest, engines cut, drivers sitting motionless inside dark cabins, listening to rain strike the metal roofs. To move forward risked detection. To remain still too long meant units in the south would go without supplies. No one needed to say it aloud, but everyone understood. If the lifeline was severed, the balance of the war would shift. Walking was no safer. Tires rolling over gravel created vibrations. Even a whispered conversation could become a signal. The problem was no longer simply crossing a stretch of jungle. It was how to move when the earth beneath you might betray your presence. On one side, command screens continued to glow steadily. On the other, transport soldiers felt the pressure tightening. They could not stop, but if they continued as before, the losses would grow. The question did not emerge in a distant conference room. It formed in the eyes of the men who had to drive through the night. What do you do when every movement can be heard? How do you advance when your very existence leaves a trace? In war, answers do not always arrive through grand declarations. Sometimes they begin with patient observation. Engineer units were sent ahead of each convoy, not to build new roads, but to study the thing that was listening to them. They found strange branches planted in the soil, cold metal hidden beneath camouflage. 4 thin antennae stretched outward as if searching for life. At first, a single heavy footstep could summon bombs, but slowly, carefully, they learned to approach. They dug around the device, examined its structure under flashlights shielded from view. The weakness was not in the sky, it was inside the device itself. When the 4 antennae were bound together, when vibrations could no longer transmit properly, the sensor fell silent. No signal, no coordinates, no aircraft. There was no dramatic moment of triumph, just a device lying still in the hands of a mud-stained engineer. Yet from that moment, the sense of helplessness began to crack. The technology still existed. Aircraft could still be called. But now, on the ground, the soldiers understood something essential. The system was not invincible. It had limits. And what could be understood could also be silenced. Once they understood how to silence the devices, the next question was no longer how to avoid them, but whether they could be used differently. War teaches a harsh lesson. If you cannot completely destroy your opponent's strength, find a way to turn it. There were mountain passes that needed widening. Engineers placed sensors deliberately along slopes they intended to clear. Vibrations were generated on purpose. The ground shook not because a real convoy was passing, but because sound had been arranged. When the bombs came, the mountainside was torn apart. Trees collapsed, rock fractured, and when the smoke thinned, soldiers moved in quietly to level the craters, shaping a new stretch of road from the damage. At other times, deception went further. Empty oil drums were tied behind trucks, clanging loudly against one another in the darkness. Metal was dragged across the earth to magnify vibrations. The sensors recorded everything. Far away, screens lit up again. Coordinates appeared. Aircraft were dispatched. Bombs fell on positions already chosen. Meanwhile, in another direction, the real convoy moved. It did not always work perfectly. Sometimes bombs still fell too close. Sometimes deception bought only a few hours. But gradually, something shifted. On the other side, certainty faded from the glowing screens. Which convoy was real? Which metallic echo was deliberate? Which tremor came from Earth and which from intention? Where was the trap? The technology still functioned, but doubt in it began to erode. And in war, doubt can be as destabilizing as firepower. Airstrikes continued. Aircraft launched in response to signals transmitted from the ground. Bombs fell across the forests of Trung San. From above, everything appeared precise. Clear coordinates, marked targets, firing solutions calculated on onboard computers. But on the ground, reality no longer aligned neatly with the numbers. Some bombing runs consumed vast amounts of fuel and ammunition, yet convoys would surface days later along a different stretch of road. Some locations were heavily struck, only for fresh tire tracks to appear in the mud not long after. The sensors kept transmitting, aircraft kept responding, but the results grew uncertain. Gradually, doubt crept into technical reports. Were the signals being distorted? Had the opposition side found a way to interfere? Or was the system simply generating too much data, too many targets, without clarity about which were real? Pilots in the sky did not see the full picture. They received coordinates, released their payloads, and returned to base. Yet after each strike, the same question lingered. Had the real convoy been hit? Meanwhile, beneath the canopy, people adapted to the rhythm of bombardment. One crater was filled while another was formed. The road was scarred, but not entirely severed. The technology remained. The computers continued their calculations, but deep in the jungle, war refused to behave with mathematical certainty. And when certainty erodes, advantage begins to wear thin, not because of a lack of firepower, but because of a growing doubt that the firepower is achieving what it was meant to achieve. When ground sensors no longer delivered absolute certainty, the war did not pause, it escalated. Over the mountains of Trung Son, a new aircraft began to appear, the AC-130. It was called a specter, a ghost, because it often arrived at night, when the forest seemed at its safest. Unlike distant bombing runs guided only by coordinates, this aircraft circled its target. It carried night